All right, so we move now into the 20th century, getting close now to the end, getting closer to the present, but still a lot of things going on. And to move now into the politics of the 20th century, we'll stay with Russia and talk about some of the political things that are going on in the 20th century and Christianity being involved with that. So during the First World War, right, in the 1914 to 1919, in the year 1917, Russia experienced its own revolution. Right? So it had kind of gotten involved in the First World War, but within Russia, there is this Marxist revolution that develops that will eventually pull Russia out of the First World War. The leader of this Marxist revolution was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, who was better known by his pen name Lenin. Lenin was a socialist who followed a lot of the teachings of Karl Marx about communal property, decrease in class differences, but came to the head of a revolution essentially in 1917. They eventually overthrow the Tsar, the Emperor of Russia, and his government, and then pull out of World War I. Eventually, there are several regions around here that would be united into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, sometimes also referred to as the Soviet Union. And so it starts off in Russia, but spreads to some areas around there that all unite under this one banner of the Soviet Union or the USSR. In the 19th century and even into the 20th, the Russian Orthodox Church had been looking for some more freedom from the state. Because, as we talked about back in the 18th century, this control that Peter the Great and some others managed to get over the church. And they've been pushing for this freedoms through the 19th century into the 20th. And they do receive some freedoms under Lenin's government in those early years. But once the revolution becomes the state, once the revolution is successful, and it's fully entrenched in this socialist government, the church once again finds itself under the state. Especially as the state promotes a militant atheism. Right? And so the government, which had been predominantly Orthodox, Christian in a sense, is now atheistic. Monasteries throughout Russia, throughout the USSR, are closed. They are later to become forced labor camps. Right? So when there would be dissidents in the state, enemies of the state, they would be sent to these monasteries and put into forced labor for the country. And by the Second World War, pretty much all of the monasteries in Russia had been closed. Churches were closed, sometimes destroyed. Clergy of all types, Orthodox and Protestant and Catholic, often were arrested. And so the church in Russia, the church is in Russia, essentially kind of go into secret. They go underground in a sense. And it appears that even though the state is pushing this atheism, a lot of people maintain their belief in God and Christ and commitments to the church, especially the Russian Orthodox Church, despite the persecution that they faced. At the beginning and the early years of World War II, however, right, in the 1940s, the Soviet leaders started to ease some of the restrictions on churches because they are being drawn into World War II. And as they're being drawn into World War II, they really feel they need the support of the people. And they know the people are still religious, even though they've been trying to make them atheists. And so, the church is a potential ally in this fight against Germany. And so during the World War II, especially in German-controlled areas, as the Germans start moving into Soviet Union, the church starts to appear more publicly. And finally, a patriarch of Moscow was allowed to be elected in 1943, which had been the first time in 20 years that there had been a patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church. After World War II, however, things started to go back to the way they were, and so the church kind of declines again. But we'll pick that up later in our narrative. But that does lead us then from World War I into World War II, and thinking about World War II. Now, the unfortunate truth is that sometimes Christians supported the Nazis in places like Germany. Sometimes supported fascist regimes in places like Spain and Italy. Sometimes it was very public support. For example, in Germany, there were many German Christians that applauded Hitler's outlawing of pornography and his installation of other moral laws. And so they often turned a blind eye to what Hitler was doing to the Jews because he was promoting some things politically that they liked. Other times, Christians, instead of being, certainly some Christians were publicly supportive of Hitler. Other times, Christians were very silent and did not speak out when Hitler sent Jews and others to the death camps. Right? So they kind of, even though they might have felt it was wrong, they didn't make any sort of effort to stop it or to speak out against it. The Pope at the time, Pius XII, seems to have tried some efforts to exercise moral authority by presenting himself as above the fray. But he also supported the fascist regimes in Spain and Italy, who were very oppressive. And he remained silent about Hitler's atrocities. And it probably has to do with the papacy being in a very precarious political position. It doesn't make it right, but that's part of the reason what's going on. German Protestant liberals often found themselves supporting Hitler because the language he was using was very similar to what they were saying. They too were talking about the perfectibility of the human race, the need to civilize the world. Some cases, what they were saying with the same language as what Hitler was using were two different things. But they often found themselves supportive of this. Other Christians, however, were quite outspoken against Nazism. Those that were outspoken often faced persecution, imprisonment, sometimes death, or exile. One individual I want to mention is a theologian named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Grew up in Berlin, studied at the University of Berlin, and becomes a pastor in a Lutheran church. When the Nazi regime takes power, he's actually living in London at the time. But he decides that he's going to return to Germany, knowing it's going to be dangerous, but considering what's going on there, he feels the need to go back and to speak out. One of his most famous works that he writes with respect to this is a work called The Cost of Discipleship. And specifically what he starts off with is, in Reformed thought, right, Reformation Protestant thought, there had been this separation between faith and obedience. Now, while Reformed Protestants would have said that obedience is important, they often downplayed it in favor of faith. And so right living often wasn't emphasized as an important part of Christian salvation to Bonhoeffer. Instead, what he saw in a lot of Reformed churches was what he called cheap grace. Here's a quote from Cost of Discipleship. Cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance, baptism without church discipline, communion without confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ. Now he contrasted that to what he called costly grace. Costly grace, he said, confronts us as a gracious call to follow Jesus. It comes as a word of forgiveness to the broken spirit and the contrite heart. It is costly because it compels a man to submit to the yoke of Christ and follow him. It is grace because Jesus says, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." Costly grace is the gospel which must be sought again and again and again. The gift which must be asked for, the door at which a man must knock. Such grace is costly because it calls us to follow. And it is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It is costly because it costs a man his life. And it is grace because it gives a man the only true life. It is costly because it condemns sin, and grace because it justifies the sinner. Above all, it is costly because it cost God the life of his Son. You were bought at a price, and what has cost God much cannot be cheap for us. Above all, it is grace, because God did not reckon his Son too dear a price to pay for our life, but delivered him up for us. Costly grace is the incarnation of God. In 1939, he decides to leave Germany, facing a lot of persecution and opposition. He decides to leave Germany and heads to the United States to take a position teaching at the Union Theological Seminary. And this is largely due because the Gestapo, or the secret police, are looking for him. He stays in the United States for 4 weeks before he decides to return. Eventually he becomes entangled with a conspiracy to kill Hitler, arguing that it was something that was needed. And again, how do you justify this? But he felt that it was necessary to take Hitler out. He was arrested by the Gestapo in April of 1943, continues to keep writing. His documents were eventually published as Letters and Papers from Prison, is the name of the title. And in it, he's very critical for how Western Christianity was largely silent about the Holocaust. That Christians weren't, taking a stand against it. In 1945, he was hanged, along with thousands of others who had resisted Nazi policies. In the years after the war, there are a variety of things that impacted Christianity. In the United States, there is this post-war boom in Christianity and Judaism as well. There's large numbers of people flocking to churches. There's the construction of churches, increases in Bible study. And there was a lot of public intellectuals discussing religion, especially Christianity, in a variety of public formats. So, in one sense, there's the what we would call the sad aspect of Christianity being so silent about some things in the Second World War, but the World War also bringing some benefits afterward. Questions about these aspects, either the Russian Revolution or what we said about World War II, both of which we could say a lot more about. We turn from those revolutions to talk about another revolution, this time in China. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the first 5 or 10 years after that, a variety of nations in Eastern Europe and in China all become communist governments. In Europe, the Orthodox Church continued to face similar challenges that the Russian Orthodox Church had. And so even though there's not Muslim control, they're now facing oppression from these communist regimes. Now, that persecution often eased up when the government needed that patriotic sentiment. Right? When they needed the people to get behind some idea. And then the restrictions, the oppression would ease. Once that period was over, then the persecution would start back again. Something similar happened in China when the Communist Party came to power in the 1940s. Many religions and religious people, not just Christianity, found themselves facing persecution with the rise of Chinese communism. Confucius, for example, and Confucianism were looked upon as a tool of the aristocracy to oppress the lower classes. And so Confucianism was targeted. Eventually, China will take over Tibet, and a lot of Tibetan Buddhists, including their leader, the Dalai Lama, will flee to India. Right? And so Buddhists are facing persecution, Confucius, and Christians as well. And what's especially part of all of this is Chinese suspicion of foreigners, and looking at Christianity as a foreign religion, right? Because it's come in through these Western missionaries. And so there's this concern among the Chinese government about missionaries and any sort of Chinese people that would convert to Christianity, especially since the Vatican was so anti-communist and the United States was so anti-communist, these two kind of Christian groups in the mind of the Chinese. Christianity was very suspicious. So missionaries were expelled or imprisoned in China. The government then tried to force Chinese Christians to join officially sanctioned organizations while ostensibly allowing religious freedom. Right? So the claim is you can freely practice this if you want, but if you want to do it legally, you've got to join one of these groups. Catholics were expected to join the Catholic Patriotic Association. Right? So, it's kind of like taking the church and putting it under the government. Protestants were expected to join the Three Self-Patriotic movement. The three selves were self-government, self-support, self-propagation. Evidently, what the Chinese government is thinking here is if these groups are cut off from outside influence, that they're going to die off. Right? Christianity is not going to sustain itself in China without the presence of Western missionaries, was the assumption. And so people that joined the patriotic associations were required to pledge support to the government and stand against imperialism, stand against the West. In fact, what happened was the opposite. That Christianity actually kind of flourished in China to some extent because of the separation from Western imperialism and because of the persecution. Now, that's not to kind of downplay the persecution that people faced. Christian leaders were re-educated or faced persecution, right? And so they were forced into these places where they would be tried to almost brainwashed or forced to recant. In the 1960s, the leader of China, Mao Zedong, inaugurated a cultural revolution because there was kind of this resurgence of capitalism that was going on in China. And he was concerned that it was making its way through the Chinese leadership, and so this cultural revolution was an attempt to stop capitalism from showing back up. And so the Cultural Revolution was meant to be this kind of purge of anti-communist or anti-Chairman Mao ideas or elements. All churches were closed, worship gatherings were prohibited, and Bibles were burnt. Eventually, the Three Self-Patriotic movement was also banned as well, even though it had been government sanctioned. Here, too, it didn't result in the decrease of Christianity, but actually the opposite. The church went underground, not literally, but went into hiding, went into secret, and developed a variety of house churches throughout China, and experienced sizable growth. Public worship was permitted again in the 1970s, but there was still the expectation of if you're going to be a Christian, you've got to register with the government. Which meant, if you are publicly worshiping in these places, you should expect that there is somebody in that worship service spying for the government. And so this surveillance continued. And so many people, many Chinese Christians, might be involved in these things, but they also had their unregistered house churches that were free from government control. But leaders who were discovered would be imprisoned or persecuted, right? And so if you found out you had a house church, then you faced penalties. These Western missionaries eventually started to go back into China, 80s, 90s, up to the present. They expected to find hardly anything resembling Christianity, but what they found was actually something very similar to what happened under the Roman Empire. Right? These house churches, this proliferation, upwards of 50 million Christians in China, it's been estimated as. So something that kind of continued and flourished. Now, 50 million, yes, in comparison to the population of China, which is over 1 billion at this point, it's, yeah, proportionally, but if you think about how much that spread in 70 years, that's a sizable group of people, but still a lot of persecution that's faced, even though there's more Western influence.